All right, everybody. It's the Working Fans Podcast with the man they call Dave. And today we got a special guest, a guy who's done wrestling, comedy, podcaster, Mr. Gene Jackson. And he's going to tell us a little about everything he's done so far. Gene, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Now, let's start off with the wrestling. You did that first. You're telling me you broke in around 97. Well, even before that, who were you a fan of growing up, and what were some of the wrestlers you liked?
So I'm 43. So my wrestling fandom picks up about 1985. I watched it all my life, but that's when I start really remembering and watching every bit of wrestling I could get my hands on. And so I liked WWF and NWA slash WCW. But growing up in North Mississippi, I was a huge fan of Continental and Memphis wrestling. So I was a huge Jerry Lawler fan, big fan of the Bullet, Bob Armstrong, and Wendell Cooley and the Nightmares, a lot of those guys. And of course, over in the NWA, Dusty Rhodes, big fan of Dusty, the Road Warriors, Rock and Roll Express. Me and a buddy of mine tied bandanas around our sweatpants to be the Rock and Roll Express one Halloween, and so a big fan of '80s wrestling. I still go back on YouTube and the WWE Network and spend a lot of time reliving those days and watching all the old school wrestling I can get my hands on. But yeah, I did start training to wrestle in 1997 over in Mississippi. A guy named Sammy Hall who had been a jobber. If you hey Rocky, that's my cat.
Running.
Cameo there. But yeah, a guy who had been a jobber for Bill Watts back in the Mid South days, got trained by him and started wrestling late December of '97 and wrestled for several years across Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas. Made a couple of trips over to Dallas for NWA Southwest, and after that, I kind of got out of the business for a little bit. Started writing columns for a couple of websites, and then eventually in 2007, I started a wrestling podcast back when it was just me, Colt Cabana, about four other people. Before nowadays everybody's got a wrestling podcast, which is cool. So
Guilty.
hey, nothing wrong with it, man. I've been
Yeah.
in and out of it, like I say, since then. Just recently started doing one here on StreamYard, like what you got going here, and I like. What do you think about StreamYard? I know we're straying off the conversation, but just momentarily, what do you think about it? It's pretty cool.
No, it's funny you say that. So, we've been doing the audio for about a year, and we just started StreamYard in the last few months. And we got with this podcast network, and we started doing a live show every Wednesday. So that's where StreamYard came in. And now, literally, I was always kind of the guy who would seek out the interviews. This is the second solo interview I've done on StreamYard. So far, I like it. Now that I'm kind of getting used to operating it and everything, it's pretty
Right.
easy to use. Um, forgive the smile throughout this thing. When you said a fan in '85, I'm 44,
All
so
right.
I'm the same thing. And I grew up in Connecticut, so northeast version of that. Snuka getting hit with a coconut by Rowdy Piper. Um,
Yes.
I remember earlier stuff, but like that's when it was like that and Hogan winning the title from Sheik was like the fandom was on. And then depending on your cable company you had for the older fans, younger fans might not know
Right.
this. Whatever you got in your area. So it started off WWF, and then I found like AWA, then NWA, and then for a cup of coffee, I was very fortunate towards the end to see Mid South when it was becoming UWF Wrestling, Bill Watts, and then
Yeah.
like holy smokes, like they had like two shows. It was like the main show. It was like Up to Date Weekly. It was like whatever it was. It was UWF Mid South Wrestling. But then it was like there was this Power Hour that followed it, where they had all
Right.
the people who weren't there anymore, but they showed these matches. And I'm looking at like Jake the Snake, all these guys I'm watching WWF, Junkyard Dog. I'm like, wow, the talent and the way they booked wrestling was so real.
So much wrestling back, man. Like when I was a kid, I was obsessed with it. I wasn't a football fan or any
Mm-hmm.
baseball, any of that crap.
Yeah.
I got up and planned my whole day. Like Saturday morning, you get up and they had the the early morning NWA show on TBS at like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. Then you had like a WWF wrestling challenge or something was on like the New Jersey channel that we got somehow in Mississippi at the time. Then you had Memphis Wrestling came on at 10, and then in the afternoon at 5:05 for us. It wasn't 6:05. World Championship Wrestling, and then Continental came on at 10, and then every now and again you had that Saturday night's main event coming on, and then every day when I got home from school, ESPN had AWA, and then eventually World Class, and later on Global down the line. So there was a lot of wrestling to be had, and man, if wrestling was on and I knew about it, I was watching it. And if there was a show going on anywhere, within a reasonable driving distance of my house, I was bugging the crap out of my dad to take me to it. So huge fan. Roxy, come on now.
I will say, and not to name drop, but just to kind of give a background here, you mentioned Legends of World Class. I mean, I got to interview some names so far that I was surprised at. Like, we got Al Snow, Morton, some people like that. But a mark out moment for me, because I had that moment where I just like watched the World Class on wrestling, like every day, come home from school. And for me, it was like on, and I love that. And I grew up kind of reliving the Von Erichs. We got to interview Ross and Marshall, and the whole time,
cool
audio interview. But I'm just so excited. I'm like, I can't believe it. I'm talking to like Kevin's kids, and just to hear stories about them, about their father and the family, and how big they were in Israel. What were some mark out moments maybe for you, whether it was in the wrestling business or even podcasting?
Well, we'll start with the podcasting real quick. So like I said, I started out at a time when there was not very many podcasts. I did the old Blog Talk Radio thing back in the day when it was first starting out. And back then, Roxy, come on now. So back then, and it's not too bad now, but like I say, there's so many podcasts. But like back then, man, you would hit people up and like, hey, do you want to do this podcast? Like, what's a podcast? And you explain it to them. They go, sure, because anybody in the wrestling business, they like to hear their self talk, and they like to, get out there any way they can. So I was absolutely shocked at some of the, I was able to have like Jimmy Hart and Jim Cornette, and Nick Dinsmore, Eugene, and Ted DiBiase's son, Mike DiBiase, that was wrestling a few years back, not the one that's in trouble now. I think maybe he is caught up in that. I don't know. I may have spoke too soon on that, but just on a lot of people from the Memphis days, Bill Dundee, and Don Bass and Brickhouse Brown, all these different guys. But the one that really got me, like I said, I was writing for this website, and there was a guy that also wrote for the website named Sal Corrente, and he shot me a message one day, and he said, "Hey man, I need you to do me a favor." And I said, "Okay, sure. What's up, man?" He's like, "I'm working with Bruno Sammartino to re-release his autobiography. Would you be willing to have him on your podcast?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Well, Sal, let me think about it. Just for you, buddy, as a favor to you, I will have Bruno Sammartino on my podcast." So he set it up, and I got like 45 minutes with Bruno Sammartino, the biggest star of the 70s and early 80s, very very early 80s. But I mean, what a gentleman, such a nice guy, and man, just the stories he told just in that podcast. And I eventually read the book, and the man, even beyond his amazing wrestling career, just lived a very, very interesting life. I mean, coming over from Italy, and I highly recommend that book's still available out there. It's on Amazon. I highly recommend you check it out. But had a great interview with him, and he even stuck around afterwards and let me know. He said, "I've done quite a few interviews promoting this book." He said, "But I could tell that you're a true fan. You had the most intelligent questions anybody asked me that were, well thought out, and it wasn't just like silly, he said, forgive my French, but mark questions, so to speak." So he had a good time. That made me feel really good that, because I was, all these interviews, I've never really been nervous about any of them, but I was nervous as hell about that interview because, like I said, Bruno is the living legend, so that, I guess, was the biggest star that I ever had on the podcast. Like I said, we've had quite a few since. And last Sunday night we had Brutal Bob Evans on, and so that was pretty cool. But as far as wrestling goes, like I said, I grew up a huge fan of Memphis wrestling, Jerry the King Lawler in particular. And so I always said when I first got in, I'm like, I'm not going to make it to WWF, obviously. There's so few opportunities in wrestling. Like if I ever get a chance to wrestle Jerry Lawler, I will have done everything I need to do in wrestling. So years rocked on. I got to wrestle quite a few names from back in Memphis over that time, and a buddy of mine called me up and he said, "Hey," he said, kind of like the Bruno Sammartino deal all over again. He's like, "Hey man, I need a favor." I'm like, "Okay," and he's like, I've got a show I'm booking and I need a tag partner." And it's one of my best friends in the world, Neil Taylor, that I've been in the business with forever. Which he was doing this kind of as a rib because he knew what this meant to me. And he's like, "I'm actually going to be working Jerry Lawler in Tupelo." And what it ended up being, when it all came together, it ended up being Neil, Jerry Lawler, and Bill Dundee against myself, Tony Dabbs, and a guy named Extreme Brett Michaels, who's not the guy from Poison. But so wrestling Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee in Tupelo, where the famous concession stand brawl happened. I mean, dream come true. And so we got to do that match. And then about 3 years later, me and Neil wrestled Jerry again, and he was tagging with Derek King. I don't know if you know him, but guy I've known and worked with for years from Memphis. And so got to wrestle him twice. Got to wrestle Carlito from the WWE one night, so that was fun. And so I never got too hung up on wrestling names. I got to work a lot of shows with a lot of the guys I grew up with, and some of those were a little disappointing. I mean, I got to work a show in 2000. This is in the Beyond the Mat era with Jake the Snake Roberts.
Okay.
I worked on 3 different shows with him, and I could tell you some stories about that, as you can imagine. Greg the Hammer Valentine, watched him snort coke off a table before he went out there to wrestle. I'm like, he don't even bump anymore. Like, what? I could see if Sabu's snorting coke off a table, he's about to go dive through a flaming table off a ladder.
Right.
Greg Valentine's out there wobbling, taking face bumps, but he's back there, snorting
coke. As soon as you said it, I'm like thinking, I popped in my head. Don't meet your heroes. They tell you a lot of times.
Hey, some of them I've met have been amazing. One of my big, and you mentioned him earlier with the coconut, Roddy Piper, one of my absolute favorites growing up. Got the opportunity to meet him 2 different times, and it was the nicest guy you ever would meet. You would think he was more excited to meet you than you were him. And he's, would sit and ask you questions about your family and your life and what you do and all this, just as nice as he could be. Dusty Rose was awesome when I got to meet him.
Nice.
I tell you, the guy I was a big fan of in the 90s, and everybody told me, like, don't meet him. He is a jerk. No one has ever had a good experience with him. But we went to a convention, and he was there, and I had to meet him. Big Van Vader.
Oh, yeah.
Got to meet him. We were the first 2 people in line to meet him, and he had the big famous Vader helmet from the early days of Big Van Vader there at the convention, and he's putting it together, which turns out that thing was fiberglass. It always looked metal, but it was like fiberglass, and so he was tying all the stuff together for it, and it's actually 3 different pieces. And he's like, "Could you do me a favor?" And of course, every time somebody asks me if I can do him a favor, it turns out to be something awesome for me. I was like, "Sure." He goes, "Do you mind putting this helmet on so I can make sure this is all secure?" Because they wasn't going to have people wearing it. It was just going to be in the background of the pictures. I was like, "Sure." So he sticks the Vader helmet. So there's a picture of me, Vader, and my wife, of me in the freaking big Vader helmet. Nicest guy in the world. I mean, so freaking cool. And then there were people who met him later in the day, like 2 hours later, who had just horror stories. "Oh my God, he was so mean. He was awful." Wonderful to us. So been very fortunate like that. Like, I really don't have. We met AJ Styles when he first left TNA at a Ring of Honor show, and he was, I don't know, he was feeling a little jerky that day and didn't seem like he wanted to be there. And so it kind of ruined my wife's fandom of him. She used to be a big AJ Styles fan. And to this day, she's like, you mentioned AJ Styles, she's like, screw him. But we've gone to, between me being in wrestling and going to conventions, like we've met a ton of my childhood heroes. And fingers crossed, there's only been one or two that's disappointed us, but otherwise, I've gotten a lot of great stories meeting them. Like I say, Jake the Snake,
Yeah.
horrible stories back in 2000. I met him 2 years ago after he got cleaned up with DDP. Nicest guy in the world. So good to see that he made it when so many others haven't.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on that. Like people are humans, and we don't know what they're going through in that particular time in their life. And then, like I can say, I went to this, aside for wrestling, I went to a UFC convention out in Vegas one time, and we met a bunch of UFC fighters out there. Some of them awesome, couldn't be more welcoming, taking pictures with us. One guy in particular, Dom Cruz, I met, nice to me. But a couple other people met him later on when he was like busy in the middle of a club somewhere. Didn't have the same experience that I had at a convention, and I'm like, okay, I get that. And I had heard horror stories about Matt Hughes from a few people, and I met Matt Hughes there, and awesome guy. At the time I was married, he's giving me like marital advice. I'm like, this is the most personable guy I could have met on this thing. But yeah, I guess it all depends on what time of the day and what they're going through.
Exactly, and I think a lot of it's how you approach them in some cases. I don't. I mean, not necessarily that other people are trying to, be abrasive when they meet them, but I don't know. But yeah, I've done the exact same thing. Like we met the Sandman, Dreamer, Sandman, and somebody else. Super cool to us. And then like 2 hours later, I seen a buddy of mine and was like, "Hey, did you meet Sand? Oh, man, F Sandman, that was the worst. Oh my God, I hope I never see him again." I'm like, really? He was super cool to us. He found out we were from Alabama, and he's like, "Yo, we wrestled in Birmingham. It was crazy. New Jack jumped out of the balcony." He started telling us all these crazy like drug stuff. We're right there in the middle of the convention. There's 75 people in line. He starts telling, "Oh man, I was coked out of my gourd that night, man." Like just all this inappropriate stuff. I mean, just fun memories. But yeah, apparently by the time they got to him in line, he was no longer in the mood to be personable.
Off topic here, did you ever work with George South?
I have met and been around George South on some shows. I've never actually got a chance to work with him. I almost did. I had a promoter that was looking to bring him in and put him against my megastar Memphis Monroe, my old school masked gimmick that I did, which is a whole other long story in itself.
We met him. By the way, he was the most awesome guy on the podcast we had. Like he was super.
Oh, did you get to have him on? Yeah, super nice guy, and has been in the business forever and worked with everybody.
Oh my God, stories for days.
He did jobs on NWA and WWF. So I mean, he was in there with just about everybody you could name.
Yeah, he told me a story recently that I thought this one was amazing. I want to say it was 30 years. I could be a little off on this, but he's been working Christmas every day since the Crockett's. And he said he wouldn't know what to do with himself on Christmas. So even this year, he found a little show in Christmas going on. And he said, my family will tell you, like, you got to get out of the house. So
that's the way them guys did it back then. You worked Thanksgiving, you worked Christmas. Mm-hmm. It's just what you did.
Now, you said you're on and off. Did you have the opportunity? I'm guessing you did the work heel and face. And did you have a preference to one?
Heel.
Yeah. I've only heard one person say babyface, but go ahead.
Out of the hundreds and hundreds of matches that I've had, I've probably had 10 matches as a babyface, and it was the most miserable. Like, I told the promoter, I'm like, if I have to be a babyface, I don't even care to do this. Like, it is no fun. It feels so unnatural, which, I mean, I've always worked in like retail management and customer service, and like even now working like tech support since COVID hit. And so, I mean, I'm typically a nice person, and so wrestling has always been my outlet to go release and vent whatever frustration I had for the week. And then to go to wrestling where I'm normally able to be just as big a jerk as I want to be, and I'm having to go shake hands with people and be nice. Did not enjoy it at all. I always prided myself on being the biggest heel on the show everywhere I went. And I've got quite a few stories of when me and Neil went to Gibson, Tennessee, the most backwood redneck town in the world, and it was like going back 30 years in history, and that was back in like 98. And their main tag team there was a team called Southern Pride. And of course, they wore rebel flag pants and carried rebel flags in the ring. Back before that was, completely unacceptable, even in the South. But so me and Neil went there, and our tag team name was Southern Destruction. And so we were anti, South. And of course, obviously, we were anti rebel flags, which made us huge heels.
Right.
But the guy who promoted the show was actually the mayor of that little town. And so our first week in, Southern Pride defends their titles, and they win their match, and they're in the ring, and they're waving the flag. Well, here come me and Neil in the back door. We attack them. We attack the promoter, lay them out. We take their rebel flag and roll the promoter up in it. And we had a bottle of charcoal lighter, which actually had water in it. But, we hose him down, and we're just about to throw the match on him as more baby faces hit the ring. We went there for like 3-4 months in a row, and we had to have a police escort out of town every time. They literally wanted to kill us. And then even in recent years, over like Pro South Wrestling over here in Piedmont, Alabama, me and my wife used to have like security escort us out and watch our car because they were threatening to slash the tires and all this kind of stuff. Even in the day of, kayfabe being mostly dead. But it's like that really old saying, Johnny Valentine, like, I can't make you think wrestling's real, but I can make you think I'm real.
Yeah.
And that's what the promoter talked to some of the fans after the shows, and they were like, why do y'all hate Gene so bad? And they're like, the rest of them guys are just playing bad guy, but he really means that stuff he said. He really looks down on us, and he really hates us. And so that's what I've always tried to do when I go to the shows is try to be the biggest heel there, and so far I've done pretty well at it.
I think you're onto something too about that retail gig, because I did retail for a while too. And some of us who worked in retail for a while, even out in wrestling, can be the biggest heels when we want to be. It's like,
oh yeah, you build that up and you can't let it out. You just got to smile and take it. And so you take it and take it, take it. Then them poor folks at the wrestling show that weekend, they're going to reap the reap the hell for them.
I never thought I'd be jealous of being a wrestler. I'm like, oh yeah, that'd be fun.
Absolutely.
Give me 1 second. I realized I never had this like mic. We're obviously hear me, it's fine, but I'm gonna just take this one. And my producer were just talking about this the other day too, and I was like, "Oh yeah, let me just." And I'm looking in the interview, I feel like, "What's off about me?" Oh, the mic, yeah. So continue on. Like I said, I've been doing like phone interviews for like the last year, so we're now kind of stepping up our quality. It's kind of funny, learning like things like we had Al Snow way too early. You know what I mean? Like, we didn't know what we were really doing. Like I just started asking people. I was surprised he said yes. It's like, oh, okay, But all right, let me get back to this here. So we're talking about heel. What about any injuries? Any major injuries that you had in wrestling?
Like I said, I started in '97, and I was very lucky and went years without any you sore this and that. And turned ankle and tweaked your knee and stuff like that. It wasn't until I guess it was around 2012. I was wrestling a match over in Jasper, Tennessee against a guy half my size. And he goes to dive on me to pin me, and his knee catches me in the rib and cracks 2 of my ribs. And so I don't wish injured ribs on anybody. I don't know if you've ever broken or hurt any of your ribs, but it is the most miserable thing in the world. So that happened, and it was 2 weeks out from my first match with Lawler.
Oh, jeez.
And so I was miserable. Couldn't sleep. If you laughed, it was miserable. If you coughed, it was miserable. Couldn't get comfortable at night. And so the doctor, was like, well, you need to take off for a couple of months. I'm like, well, I've got a match with Jerry Lawler, so that's not happening. So anyway, I show up for that match with Jerry Lawler, and just a quick side story along with that, because it goes along with this injury thing. So my ribs were starting to feel a little better. They weren't completely healed, but they were manageable. So they put all of us in a room, except Lawler wasn't in there at the moment. He was off helping. Brian Christopher was on the show too, and him and Brian was off doing something. And so they throw us all in the room. And so Dundee's like, well, what are we going to do for the finish? And turns out, I didn't know, but he was actually ribbing because Lawler calls all the finishes on his matches. But I didn't know that.
Okay.
So Dundee says that, and I'm like, well, I've actually been thinking about this. So this wasn't long after he had started back wrestling after the heart attack, that nearly killed him. And so I said, well, I've been, this gimmick I was doing at the time, this Memphis Monroe thing, I tried to tie in every old school Memphis. I had a loaded boot, and I did the heart punch and did the claw, and like every 70s and 80s gimmick in the world. I did all of them. And so I was kind of joking, but I was like, well, what if for the finish, we had our manager, Hollywood Jimmy Blaylock. I said, what if me and Lawler are in the ring, you guys are fighting on the floor, Jimmy sneaks in and he hooks Lawler, and I go for the heart punch, and everybody knows he just come back from a heart attack, and then when I come across, I charge him, and then Lawler moves, I hit Jimmy with the heart punch, Lawler schoolboys me 1, 2, 3. And Dundee's like, well, okay, that might work. And so a couple minutes later, Lawler walks in the room, and Lawler goes, so what are we doing? And Dundee goes, oh, Memphis Monroe hitter. He called a good finish. Let's see if you want to do it. He's going to punch your heart in. And Lawler goes, what? And he goes, go ahead, Monroe. Tell him you'll finish. And so I was like, now I can kind of tell I'm getting ribbed, So I'm like, King, here's what I came up with. And so we went through it, and he goes, I like it. Let's do it.
Nice.
And everybody looks dumbfounded. So we all start to, and so Dundee pulls me aside and he goes, I've been wrestling with him for 40 years. I've never seen him use anybody's finish. Good job, kid. I was like, cool.
Yeah.
Well, comes time for the finish. And I don't know if he did this because I called it or if he literally forgot. But as I charge him, he forgets that he's supposed to just move so I can hit Jimmy. He gives me a boot to the stomach, which catches me exactly in the ribs that I had cracked, and now they were officially broken. So I run in full speed, not expecting a foot. He throws a foot up. I run into it. Boom, gets the ribs, and I'm like,
oh no.
He schoolboys me, which rolls me in a ball as my ribs are now broken. And as we're rolled up, it was 1, 2, 3, and I'm laying there holding my ribs, and Jimmy comes over and is like, "Are you all right?" I'm like, I couldn't speak for like 5 minutes. So I ended up going back to the doctor that Monday. Turns out now they're actually broken. And after that, oh my gosh, like it took me probably 3 years before they were healed up completely. Like I took 6 months off from wrestling, come back, and they were okay. And then I gave somebody an elbow drop, and the way my side hit them, it dislocated them again. Like it was just an ongoing thing. And that's really the only nagging injury that I've ever had. But my gosh, like I said, that was just an ongoing thing for probably 2 or 3 years.
Hats off on getting that finish approved too. Man. I'm listening to that, and I'm like, this is a good fit. I like it because one thing I noticed that you're doing in a lot of stuff is that I always remember this, even though I know I picked up on it later. But the first guy I ever pointed out, I think it was in his book, was Terry Funk talked about bringing something personal and bringing something real life into it. And I see, like, you try to do little elements of that there, and with the heart punch and everything. And I'm like, I wonder if he'll buy it, because that sounds like a great idea. Yeah.
When right before we went to the ring, he pulled me aside. He goes, "Hey, just to make sure everybody here understands what you're doing, cut a promo before the match starts. Talk about my heart attack, and let everybody know that you're planning on giving me the heart punch. And not only are you going to beat me, you're going to kill me right here in front of God and everybody in Tupelo." And I was like, when he walked away, I looked at Jimmy. I said, "That's kind of strong." And he goes, "Lawler told you to do it. You better do it." And I'm like, well, all right. So sure enough, we get. And so what's funny is, like, my dad, I'd done this for all these years. My dad had been to one show. My mother's never even seen it. My mother hates wrestling, so she's never even seen a tape of me wrestling. Can't believe that I could be a bad guy. Like, not my Jimmy. But so my dad and my uncle and my brother and a whole bunch of people that I went to college with that I hadn't seen in years. So there was about 30 people in the crowd at least that specifically came, that knew me personally and came to see me do this. And all of them at time, it was like, the last thing I heard about Jerry Lawler, he almost died. Like, he's going to wrestle? Like, yeah, he's going to wrestle. So I get out there and we're about to start, and I grab the mic and I'm like, Jerry Lawler, you were my hero as a kid, but now it's time for you to go. And not tonight, not only am I going to beat you, I'm going to put you out for good, because everybody knows I'm the master of the heart punch. And when I punch you in your heart tonight, I'm going to finish what God started up in Canada. And when I said that, Dundee's eyes got this big around.
Oh, man.
My dad was right behind Lawler in the crowd, and I could see him like shaking his head, because I guess he thought I had went into business for myself and didn't know Lawler had told me to say this. So when I said that, oh my gosh, the building just, everybody goes, I guess they thought on top of, like, okay, this is wrestling, we get it, but that was freaking tacky, dude. Like, you don't bring up a guy's heart attack and say you're going to kill him and finish what God started. So, we did the match and all that, and we get to the back, and like I said, I can barely talk, and I'm holding my ribs, and Lawler comes over to me, and he throws his hand on my shoulder, and he's like, finish what God started, huh? He's like, I know I told you to bring up the heart attack, but geez, kid, that was kind of stiff. I go, I'm sorry. I said, so was the kick. He goes, I swear to God, I didn't do that on purpose. He said, right after you ran into my foot, I remember, oh crap, I was supposed to move. He goes, I'm sorry about that. I said, no, it's fine. I'm okay. I didn't tell him.
That's funny.
Ribs were broke, but yeah, that was pretty memorable. My friends still bring that up to this day when I threatened to kill Jerry Lawler in Tupelo.
Yeah, so I mean, I can imagine. So smart on his part to talk about the promo ahead of time and make sure everybody knew what was going on. And then, yeah, what a moment for you, man. I mean, you're wrestling your hero, biggest match, and then you're dealing with busted ribs, which end up getting broke afterwards. And your family and friends are there. Like, that's a crazy story, man. Wow.
It was like I said, and I don't just say that just to make this all tie together. There's plenty of people that can substantiate this, but that was my goal from day. Like, I could have went home that night and never did this again. I mean, like, that was it. That's what I set forth to do, was wrestle Jerry Lawler, and I think I got to do it in the coolest way possible as far as I was concerned, and then getting to do it again. Now, okay, let me tell this story real quick.
Okay.
So here's something interesting about the second time that I wrestled him. Right. So when I wrestled him again in Amory, Mississippi, it just so happened my brother now by this time my brother has 3 kids, so he brings his wife and his 3 kids. My dad comes again, and Jerry Lawler has, he's a famous guy, so he's got a lot of odd friends. Well, one of his good friends is the guy who played the kid who got his tongue stuck to the pole in A Christmas Story, Scott Schwartz. And so Scott comes 2 or 3 times a year and just hangs out with Lawler at his house for 3 or 4 days. Well, it just so happens that he was at Lawler's house the weekend of this show, so Lawler brings him with him. And so we're in the dressing room and he's like, hey guys, did y'all ever watch A Christmas Story? I'm like, well, of course, everybody watches it 50 times every Christmas because they run it for 24 hours. He's like, well, this is the kid that got his tongue stuck to the pole. This is Scott Schwartz. And I'm kind of looking for a minute. I'm like, that is who that is. So I'm like, well, that's interesting. So, and he was in The Toy with Richard Pryor, which was a movie. I was a Richard Pryor fan as a kid, so I remembered that movie. And I was like, oh, that's pretty neat. We're meeting this guy. And so Lawler leaves the room and he comes over and grabs me and Neil and Jimmy, and he's like, guys, like, I have wanted to be involved in wrestling all my life. I'm a huge wrestling fan. He's like, y'all have got to talk Jerry and let me do something in this match. And Jimmy's like, what? He's like, well, let me do something with you. He said, you're managing them. Maybe I could manage Jerry and Derek, and then we can do a spot or something. And of course, now Jimmy, who, his nickname's Hollywood Jimmy, he's done a lot of TV stuff and everything, but in his mind, he's like, oh, I'll get to work with this TV star or movie star,
Right.
But he was all about it. And so a few minutes later, here comes Jerry back in the room, and Scott's like, hey, they want to ask you something. And he rolls his eyes, and Jimmy's like, hey, what if Scott manages y'all? And me and him, he goes, this again? He says, Scott, I've already told you, you're not trained. I can't have you go out there and get hurt. And he's like, this guy's been doing this forever. I'm not going to get hurt. And so he's like, if you guys want to do it, whatever, that's fine. So we work out a spot for him. Well, then a few minutes later, here comes Brian, his son, Brian Christopher, comes rolling in. He's not booked. He just shows up. And he tries to get on the show, and the promoter's like, man, this thing's booked up. Yeah, I don't have a spot for you. And he's like, well, can I go out there and sell gimmicks? And Terrell's like, sure, yeah, you can go out there at intermission and sell gimmicks. And Brian's like, can I come in on the finish? And Lawler's like, who else can come ask to be? I was like, we got Scott wants to be in the match. Now you want to be in the match. Like, where's Bill? Is he going to show up in a minute? So they ended up coming up with the finish where Jimmy comes in. Like him and Jimmy and Scott do a spot at the beginning before the match where Scott ends up pushing him down and gets a pop from the crowd. And then at the end, Jimmy pushes Scott down, slides in the ring. And I'm holding Jerry, and Neil's holding Derek, and Jimmy's fixing to throw powder in their face. Brian slides in, kicks the powder into Jimmy's face, and then they roll us up 1, 2, 3. I didn't call that finish, but I thought it was, pretty good. So I don't know. It was just a crazy, so now I've got this story where I got to wrestle my hero again, and then his famous son interfered. But then this guy from this movie I've watched since I was a kid, that we watch every year at Christmas. And so now every year, if we're at my parents' house and my dad's like, see that kid right there? Gene wrestled with him and Amory in a match and blah, blah, blah. So just kind of a weird Amory, Mississippi, which isn't big as anything, which is where I was actually born, strangely enough. 4 miles from there in a hospital, we got to work with Jerry Lawler, Brian, and Scott Schwartz, who played the kid who stuck his tongue to a pole, which I tried to talk him into getting his tongue stuck to the ring post for the spot. He wouldn't have it. Like, well, if anything, Jimmy's got to do it. And Jimmy's like, I'm not putting my tongue on that ring post. People's bled on that.
Well, I don't think we can end the wrestling portion of this with a better story. Wrestling Lawler twice. So I'm going to give you just a second introduction. We'll do the comedy portion. And then at the end of the comedy portion, I'm going to let you promote whatever you want to. We'll,
okay.
Do that. But yeah. All right. This is the first time I've ever done it like this, where I'm doing 2 parts. But I figured since you've done both, we'll just get what we get out of the comedy too, even though I've said you dabbed in it. So see how it goes.
Cool.
All right, everybody. It's the Working Fans podcast with the man they call Dave. We're doing the Working Fans comedy cast again. And today, who I just had on the wrestling episode, Mr. Gene Jackson, is continuing to talk to us. And today we're going to talk about his time in comedy. Gene, tell us about how you broke into comedy and why you even thought about doing comedy. How did that come about?
So, I told you in the previous podcast about what a huge wrestling fan I was. The only other thing that I was a huge fan of was comedy. I loved watching, which this sounds weird to say now, considering how everything's turned out since then. But when I was a kid,
Bill Cosby.
Right?
I know, I'm there with you. Go ahead.
On Cinemax, they would show Bill Cosby himself, that famous comedy special, all the time. And at one point, when I was 10, 12 years old, I could probably quote that. I could probably perform it in front of a crowd, word for word. And so it really, amazed me. Like, people get paid, like people make a living standing up there telling jokes and, being funny. So I always liked, watching comedy. Eddie Murphy Raw, Delirious, Rodney Dangerfield. I was a big fan of him when I was a kid. And so all these different comedians, and I enjoyed it, but I never thought about actually really, I thought it was cool that they do it, but I didn't really think about actually doing it myself. I didn't know how you'd even go about it, so, but I always watched it. And then I went to the Stardome in Birmingham, which is a comedy club, and watched, who did we go see? Witherspoon, the dad from Friday.
Yeah.
John Witherspoon,
John,
I guess.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Embarrassing, I'm blanking out on him. But anyway, we went to go see him. And at the end, they were like, hey, check out our open mics, every third Saturday or whatever it was. And we got in the car, and my now ex-wife, we were heading home, and I was like, open mic, huh? I was like, I might try that. And so I've signed up. Because you had to sign up for it ahead of time and all this. And man, it turns out stand-up comedy is a lot harder than it looks. Most folks think, well, you just get up there and you're funny. Right. Or you just get up there and you tell jokes. And I mean, it's one thing to be the funny guy in your circle of friends. It's one thing to be the funny guy at work because you know those people, you know what they find humorous. you usually have, things in common or stories, or, they have some insight into what you're talking about. But to make plans to go to a comedy club in front of people you don't know who's going to be there, you don't know how many of them's going to be there, and have material prepared that can potentially make people laugh of all walks of life, different ages, races, whatever, group you want to say, it's pretty hard. So I listened, at the time I had a 45-minute commute to work every morning back and forth, and I had XM radio. So I listened to those comedy stations on there all the time, which actually was the worst thing in the world when you were trying to write comedy material, because you start feeling like there's nothing that hasn't been covered. Like everybody talked about everything. Like there's not a fresh idea to be had. So I finally just had to quit doing that. But anyway, I came up with a few jokes and went down, and I did pretty well. Got a good, they got a good reaction, and so I went back a second time and did pretty well that time. And the owner of the club was like, "Hey, keep coming back. You're doing well." But where I screwed up initially, and I still have a problem with this to this day, is I knew a lot of the same people were coming back. It's kind of like going to working wrestling shows back then. 70% of the crowd is the same people over and over, because, and 30% of the crowd is the same because they're there with the wrestlers. They're the family, the friends, the hangers on, whatever. And so in my mind, I'm like, well, these people seen me do that material last time. I'm not going to go. So I was trying to write a whole new set every time I went. And then one time, about the fourth time I went, my friends at work was like, "You should tell stories from work. We got all these hilarious stories." And so I was like, "All right, well," we came up with some of the best stuff. And I get up there and I'm about three stories in, and it's dying. Like it's the first time that I've gone up and I'm getting nothing. So I freak out. I don't want to do the stuff I've already done. So I just start like doing crowd work, like heel wrestler.
Okay.
Like started ripping on people in the crowd, which, they, I'm not Don Rickles, so they're not too, forgiving of that. So I come to the back, and the club owner, he's like, "What the hell was that?" I'm like, "Dude, what I was doing wasn't working." So I just started doing crowd work. He's like, "That was bad guy wrestler stuff," because he kind of knew my story. He's like, "That's bad guy wrestler stuff. That's not what we do here." He's like, "Well, why didn't you do the Alabama Auburn thing? Why didn't you do this?" Well, I was like, "Well, I already did that." And he's like, "That's what you do, man. You go up, you get you a set, and you weed out the stuff that don't work, but the stuff that works, you do that every time you go up." He's like, "You know how many times Ron White told tater salad, to the same people?" And so I was like, okay. And it pained me to do that, because like I said, I always prided myself when I would go, I would do shows every Friday night as a wrestler. I didn't go say the same hateful stuff to him. I had new and improved hateful stuff each and every week. So I started doing that and started trying to repeat the material some. But then my job schedule changed. So like I say, that was around 2006. So then, gosh, probably 3-4 years passed before I got to do it again. I went back to the Stardome, did some more open mics there. But during those open mics, I met a guy named Jesse who was doing radio for the Rick and Bubba show as the Casio Kid. And then he did Jay Leno under the name Matt Mitchell when he moved, because he moved out to LA for a while and did some stuff with the Groundlings and whatnot out there. And so we got to be pretty good friends. And he was a wrestling fan. I didn't know how much until in recent years, now that him and Conrad got to know each other, and now people know him via Conrad's podcast.
Right.
But he, like I say, he got well known doing Rick and Bubba as an intern on Rick and Bubba, and then he moved to Huntsville, and he's morning radio DJ in Huntsville. Jimbo and Casio, a pretty big deal there. But he's originally from Gadsden, Alabama, and so my wife's from Gadsden. And so he was going to do a show at a theater, the Ritz Theater there in Gadsden. First time he was ever doing comedy in his hometown. And so he was getting a guy named Arky Shea who did radio in Birmingham or Huntsville as well, and then a guy who was just starting a tour at the time named Corey Forrester, who has since become pretty well known in comedy with the oh gosh, there's a whole group of them. I'm blanking. That's embarrassing. I'm blanking out them right now. But Corey Ryan Forrester, he does this wrestling gimmick now in this comedy called the Buttercream Dream. Gosh,
this is,
what do they call
he's
themselves?
part of Conrad's friends, right? They're all like the
Yeah, he's one of Conrad's friends as well. Well,
the Sad News Bears or something. He does a thing. But
yeah. So he asked me, did I want to MC? And so I was like, sure, because MC spot, in comedy, I guess but for the people listening who don't, you come out, you do 5 or 10 minutes, introduce the comic, they go up, you go out, you introduce the next comic, and you might do a joke or so in between. And so he asked me to do that. So that was one of the first shows I did that wasn't an open mic. It was actually a booked gig in a theater with a pretty big crowd. He did pretty well because, like I said, Cassio was well known. He was the class clown of his high school there at Emma Sampson High School in Gadsden, and everybody had been listening to him on the radio all those years. So that was a pretty cool deal. And then I've done some shows at the Comedy Catch in Chattanooga. I've done some shows at Stand Up Live in Huntsville. I've done some shows at Zany's in Nashville.
Okay.
And the thing that really stood out to me that was kind of crazy is breaking into wrestling and breaking into comedy are almost identical. Like it's the same thing. You go to small shows starting out for no money, and just you have to offer to do whatever you can to get your foot in the door, and then as you do it, you start leveling up and you meet people. Like I said, like I met Cassio just doing those open mics, and when I met him, it turns out that I had worked with a couple of girls that he went to school with that knew him really well. So we kind of bonded over that. And, next thing you know, we're friends. And then he remembers me 3 years later and so on and so forth. But like I say, breaking into comedy and breaking into wrestling is very similar. And your chances of success are about equal in each one.
Now, did having the mic time in pro wrestling, obviously you already said it's still – being a comedian is a lot tougher, but do you think that does give you an advantage over comedians starting in your same spot? I mean, at least you talk to people, right? Yeah, so
100%. Because when I would go to those open mics, and they would have probably 12, 15 people go up, and you're all sitting back here together. Most all of those guys and girls were scared out of their mind at the thought of going out in front of a crowd of people, number one. Number two, scared at the thought of a bad reaction or any kind of rejection. Wow. And so I hung out with 4 or 5 guys in the bar area waiting to go up. And so I go up, and they said right before I went there, like, man, you don't seem nervous at all. I'm like, I'm nervous about whether my material is going to land, but I'm not worried about talking in front of people. And so I went out and came back, and they were like, damn, man, it looks like you've been doing that 20 years as far as, your comfort level on stage and everything. And I said, well, here's the thing. I'm like, I'm used to going in front of a crowd of people who all hate my guts. They're booing. They're saying awful things about me, I said, so going out in front of a neutral crowd, I said, I've heard the worst things anybody can say to me. I said, so I'm not worried about that. I'm comfortable going out in front of large groups of people. I said, now trying to get a large group of people to like me intentionally or make them laugh, I said, that makes me a little nervous. I said, but not really, because there's nothing on the line here. If the worst case scenario, if I really, really suck and do awful, they'll let me come do it again in 3 weeks. It's not like you're going to get back. Your jokes were so terrible, you can never come back. Because even after, like I say, even the night that I turned heel on the crowd and was just running people. I mean, there was a guy at the back of the room who looked like 50 Cent. And I told him, I was like, smile so I can see you, 50, because he had this big gold tooth. And then I realized, like, oh, that sounded really racist. That's terrible. I probably could never go back again if I did that today, but that wasn't my intent. But But like I said, worst things that happen is you just come back, try it again the next time. So
I imagine in the same token too, like if you're bombing, it also helps you with that, being used to that kind of reaction.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you're like, well, okay, well, maybe I can be the if the making everybody laugh doesn't work, and if I can't make people like me, I can lean into it. And I can just be the guy that goes out and just bombs harder than anybody, and then that almost becomes a thing. Luckily, I didn't have to do that though.
I just asked the comedian this about a week ago. I bring it up to you. I guess it might almost reaffirm it. Maybe you can shed a little more light on it. Because I talked to him about in pro wrestling, the best characters they always tell you tend to be extensions of yourself. So in comedy, I would think the best comedy routines are extensions of your own sense of humor. And he called it finding your voice. They want to try to find your voice in comedy. What are your thoughts about that? Is that part of the similarities?
Yes. People, just like in wrestling, people who try to create characters and create a voice that is in no way genuine to their personality or who they are usually fail. I mean, it's got to be, and then there's a lot of people that go through a series of attempts before they finally come around. And you can watch even some of your favorite comedians. You can go watch their old stuff, and you can see, okay, that was before they figured it out. Like that's not who I've been watching in the last several years. But something that struck a chord with me. Of course, this was after I had already been doing it a while. But one of my favorite comedians is Anthony Jeselnik.
Yep.
I don't know how familiar you are with him, but
on the roast.
he's almost like yes, exactly. That's where he became famous, and he's almost like a heel comedian in my head.
Yeah.
Well, I listened to him. He did a podcast with I want to say, gosh, who was it? Maybe Jim Norton. I don't know, but he did a podcast. And they were kind of talking to him, and you don't catch him out of character very often, but he was kind of talking about the background, and they're like, so what was the root of all this? Like, when did you decide to go the route that you went? And he said, when this all clicked with me, he said, I was at Madison Square Garden at a wrestling show. He said, and Razor Ramon was in the ring, and he said, and he was the bad guy because that was even his gimmick.
Right.
He said he's the bad guy. He goes, but he was the bad guy. And people were booing. Like when he come out, people were booing and they were throwing stuff. And he won the match and they were mad. He said, but then as soon as he left the ring, he's like, the girl next to me goes, I love that guy. He's awesome. And everybody's like high five and go, oh yeah, he's awesome. And he's like, oh, they get it. Like that guy is not a bad guy. They just get that that's character he's playing. Right. And he said, it occurred to me that you don't really have that in comedy, really. He said, I always wondered, could I go up on stage and just be a complete a-hole, but people still kind of get it. And if you watch his stuff, he's very smart about it because he says like he says these horrible jokes, but then he'll give this little smile afterwards with this kind of a wink that kind of gives you like, all right, we're joking here. Don't get too serious. But like I love his material. Like one of my favorite jokes of all time is when he gets up there and he's like, yeah, when I was a kid, he said, my parents always believed that they had to have a gun in the house. They had to have a gun to protect their 5 children. He said, but eventually they got rid of the gun to protect their 4 children. Stuff like that. But he's one of my favorites. Tom Segura, I'm a huge fan of, even though he talked a lot of crap about pro wrestling. But I get it. But I've struggled with that, because you don't want to. I hate, like when I first started doing these open mics. Like I said, this is around 2006. And so you could sit there and watch and go, that guy likes Larry the Cable Guy. That guy likes Mitch Hedberg. That dude's trying to be Chris Rock. And like, I never wanted anybody to sit out there and go like, he's funny, but he's trying to be Jeselnik, or he's trying to be Dave Attell, or whoever the case may be. So I tried to be very aware of that. Like, okay, you can study these people and borrow things from them. But you know, some people you can just tell that that's what got them into comedy, and they are now almost doing an impression of them on stage, and that drives me up the wall. Even if you're not just outright doing somebody's material, to go out there and just steal somebody's persona to me is just as bad.
Sure. I mean, you don't want to be in the ring and you're not trying to rip off Jerry Lawler and come off like you don't want to be a carbon copy.
You don't want to be Paul Lee. I don't know if you know who that is.
Oh, yeah. I just came into it's so funny. For as long as I'm watching wrestling, I didn't find out about Paul Lee until about a year or two ago. Oh, actually, right when the first Talking Shop came out. And I'm like, what the hell is this? My buddy's like, oh, you haven't seen Paul Lee before? I'm like, no. I'm like, oh, shit. Then you find out he's made a career out of that. But
yeah, I mean, I'm glad Talking Shop are using him in the way that he should be used now, as a complete joke and pure comedy. But I mean, I have done serious shows where people have booked, like I did a show in Ripley, Mississippi, where they booked him against Coco Beware. And you know, Coco, I guess, didn't know what he was up against, and they brought him in, and he brings the Flair robe, and because I mean, I don't know if you know his backstory, but like he paid Flair, like $10,000 to walk out in front of a crowd in a like sports bar somewhere in Georgia to say that he's the new Nature Boy, and he's handing him over the name and all this kind of crap. And so that guy walked in, and Coco is a pretty volatile fellow to have been the Birdman and the fun-loving dancing guy in the 80s. He's an angry dude in the 2000s. And so I happened to be sitting just a few feet away from him. And so Paul Lee comes in, and he's like, can we cuss on here? I don't know what your language thing.
It's fine. No,
so he's like, and I don't really know Coco, but he kind of tapped me on the arm. He's like, who the fuck is that? I said, it's the guy you're working tonight. It's Paul Lee. He goes, because he come in acting like not in front of the crowd. He walks in the dressing room. Woo, what's up, baby? And he had a suit on. He's carrying the robe and got the sunglasses in the dressing room. He's like, is he trying to be Ric Flair? I'm like, oh, we're Coco. We're 10 miles past trying to be Ric Flair. I'm like, dude, he swears he is the real Nature Boy. I said, yeah, you'll see. And he just put his head in his hands. He's like, I'm like, whoop his boy's ass. And I'm like, more power to you, man. I'm like, you'll be over more than you already are if you whoop his ass. Man, everything he did to him, he lit him up, chop. And that's what's funny. He's like, you want to be Ric Flair? And he backed him in the corner and just starts lighting him up with chops. And after every one of them, Coco was going, woo, woo. So now we're off on wrestling. It's supposed to be the comedy.
You know what? I mean, first of all, that's comedy gold. And secondly, I mean, that's something you don't have to deal with up and stand up. Nobody's going to actually beat you up at least.
Yeah. Even though some people need it, but
yeah, I'm sure. Sure. So I guess one final comedy question. Two, actually. Actually, I want to ask you a random comedy question. Favorite comedic movie?
Ooh, I guess that's so tough. But if I have to say one, Tommy Boy with Chris Farley.
Oh, yeah, excellent choice.
It's one of those that anytime it ever comes on, I've got to sit and watch it, and I laugh just as hard the 10,000th time as I did the first time. Love it.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a good choice. And you've done so much stuff now, podcasting, comedy, wrestling. Have you ever thought about doing any acting too, or anything else? Because you definitely seem versatile.
I would like to, but here in North Alabama, there's not a lot of opportunity to break into to acting. I guess maybe if I was over closer to Atlanta, where they seem to be filming everything nowadays, I could have maybe been a zombie extra or something for Walking Dead, or maybe I could have been the fat guy in Cobra Kai or something. But probably not, being where I'm at. I'll probably just have to roll with the wannabe comedian and wrestler.
Now, actually, one thing, comedy or wrestling, have you done either one in the empty arena setting?
I have not. Okay. I've had the opportunity to, at least the wrestling, and I mean, I've wrestled in some almost empty arenas way before COVID. But I've had a couple of family members and quite a few friends I've lost a couple of family members and lost a couple of friends and had a lot of them affected by it. And so like I said, I'm lucky. I was managing a furniture store when this all happened, and I got sent home on a Friday. And on Sunday, or Saturday, I put in an application for a tech support job working from home. And by Monday evening, I had that job. And by that Wednesday, I was working it. So I've been able to work from home. So I haven't had any reason that I have to go out and be exposed. And it's bad here in Alabama, man. It is really, really bad. Like here where I'm at in Coleman, like they're turning people away from the hospital because they just don't have any more room. So yeah, I haven't went out and performed. I've gotten some offers recently to do some commentary for a couple of shows, and so I'm considering that because I'm not going to go in the dressing room. I'm just going to come in the front door, go to the commentary booth, and then go right back out the same door I came in if that plays out. Nothing against anybody, but I'm just, I don't know, man. I'm not the healthiest dude in the world. I'm afraid if I got it, it would do me in. So I'm trying to ride this thing out.
Yeah, I understand that. Now, well, you've been gracious enough to talk to me about wrestling, comedy. Anything you want to promote? Anything social media? Tell people what's going on. Your podcast. Hit it.
So my moniker since I've been doing the podcast and writing on the websites and all that, a takeoff on Howard Stern has been the king of all wrestling media. So on Facebook, facebook.com/king of all wrestling media. If you want to add me on Facebook, like I say, every Sunday night, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, we have Cheap Heat TV live with my co-host Charles Anders, and we always have a wrestling guest on. This week we've got Cabana Man Dan coming up. We had Bob Evans last Saturday. If you would go facebook.com/Cheap Heat TV live, you can like the page, and all the shows, StreamYard shows, are right there. We also have an audio version of the show on Anchor that we put links up to as well for each episode, so you can see it or hear it, whatever's more convenient, because I know a lot of people like to listen to it on their commute. They don't want to have to see my ugly mug for an hour, so you can just listen to it. That's usually the preferred way of getting it. But I'm lazy. I did the audio thing like you for many years, and man, I would have to record the conversation and then edit it all together on Audacity and all that stuff. And now, boom, StreamYard. I download the MP3, I upload it to Anchor. It's right there. I don't have to do any work. So but yeah, I've got that podcast going on. So yeah, you can find all that facebook.com/king of all wrestling media. Add me on there. I pretty much accept just about everybody that adds me, and you can see what all I got going on. And thanks for having me, man. I'll be glad to do this anytime you ever get bored. I've still got a shit pile of stories I can tell you. All of them true, some of them strange, but all true.
I'm gonna take you up on that offer. So I appreciate you doing the show, man. Thank you so much. And this was definitely an interesting, fun time. We'll be in touch for sure, man. Thank you so much for doing this.
All right, thanks.